with me. Today I have Dr. Robert Plomin, who's one of the foremost behavioral geneticists in the world. When you have questions about how genetics impact our psychology, our intelligence, Dr. Plomin is the person. He's also a member of Nucleus' Scientific Advisory Board. So, Robert, welcome.
Well, thanks. It's great to be with you, Kian. It's been great being involved with Nucleus. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that. I'm curious, in your mind, you must have seen a decades worth of sort of not just scientific progress, but ideological progress, right? You see
Absolutely.
people's actual minds and understanding of genetics changing. And so I'm curious, what was it like to actually publish this book? Did you have any skittishness toward using the word blueprints, knowing that perhaps it would provoke certain people? Tell me more about this.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of interesting stories there. I was approached by this publisher, actually agent, Brockman, who well-known agents for scientific publications in New York, very aggressive, you don't get a better deal. Their motto is, if you ever get a royalty, they haven't done their job, because you should get an advance so big that you couldn't possibly recover it in a royalty. So he approached me, the old man approached me in about 1980. He wanted me to do
In
a book.
1980, really?
1980, because he
Wow.
saw that this stuff was hot and it was just really starting to come, for people who didn't have a knee-jerk reaction against genetics. There was enough data coming out then that the writing was certainly on the wall for people who wanted to read it. But, I realized at that time it was just so controversial. And I was just, a young, I think I was probably an associate professor by that point in 1980. I started in 1974 at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And, so I really just consciously decided, nope, I was going to keep my head down, just do the research. And as the mountains of evidence from twin, adoption, and now DNA studies piled up, by the time I was approached again, almost 30 years later, I thought, well, certainly I'm so far along in my career now, I don't care. I'm just going to tell it like it is, and um, I was still, to your point, your question, I was still extremely worried about the reaction to the book. I mean, I mentioned in the preface to the book that some of my friends said it was a professional suicide note,
Really?
because even in 2019, there was a lot of not just ignorance, but real antipathy towards genetics for wrong reasons. Clinical psychologists thought it would put them out of business. We can talk about all that, but it's not at all threatening to what people do. And you think knowledge is a good thing to have. But anyway, I think I was right I was certainly right in waiting, but I was surprised by the reaction, because the paperback edition of the book has an afterword, which it was published 6 months after the hardback was published, and it was my reactions, to these sorts of issues, like what's happened in the 6 months since. And what surprised me most is that the public reaction was almost entirely positive. I gave scores of talks to public groups. I did lots of book signing. I didn't get any hostility. The general reaction, which I loved, was, God, I didn't know about any of this stuff. It makes such good sense. Why haven't we heard about this before, about the importance of genetics? Whereas, 20 years earlier, even from the public, I'd get some really hostile reactions. So I think that's a huge shift. And
And that's
I, I-
that's interesting, Robert, because from your perspective then, and this is something that I've seen, which is sometimes the academics think that their perspective is the public's perspective. And
exactly
they
right.
think they have a gifted, unique perspective and control on what people think, the general public, as well as what people should think, as well as what they can even see or even know about. That's been our experience, and I'm sure yours is similar. Probably, do you think that's fair?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. The response from academics there was definitely some hostility there. Someone wrote a review in the journal Nature, but he's a historian of science. I mean, he doesn't, know the real science of it. And his main message, to your point, was it was sort of like he didn't like the message.
Yeah.
And
And Robert, this is something interesting. I was telling people internally this, where so often what I find running Nucleus is people don't actually look at what the science says. They use science to push an already existing political ideology. So they have a worldview, right? And maybe the worldview is more nature or more nurture. And then they try to skew whatever the genetics is to fit that worldview versus looking at
Yeah.
the science and saying genetics is obviously material. To your point, it's never entirely deterministic, right? We're never building models that will explain 100% of variation, right? That's not going to happen. But genetics has a very strong material impact on the continuum of diseases and traits that you point out, right? And
Could I
so
say
it's very interesting.
one more thing
Yeah,
about this history, Ken? That
yeah.
the strongest negative reactions come from the field I'm interested in, and that's education, which I think of as the business end of cognitive development. And there's still quite a bit of hostility there, you know. And but as I've tried to talk to people in education, and it's interesting, even there, you don't find teachers hostile to genetics. You can't teach 30 kids and think that they're all the same in how they learn. So there's
100%.
that. But also in terms of this reaction and the cultural shift, I just like to mention that this guy, Leon Kamen, who I mentioned, who wrote this book called The Science and Politics of IQ in 1974, um, he started a group at that time, which was like the early culture war stuff. It was called Science for the People. And who are these scientists who tell us what's for the people? They're all Harvard professors. I mean, how ridiculous is that, that they think they speak for the public? But anyway, I was really pleased with the reaction because I wrote the book for the public. I didn't write it for academics. I've published over 1,000 papers, so I've done my bit for academics. But this was for the people, and when I talk to people, I just love their reaction. I don't think I had a single hostile remark. People are
Wow.
concerned. They'll ask you about, oh, what about epigenetics? You got to explain that doesn't have anything to do with heredity. And um, the media people, they seem to have a bee in their bonnet about this issue of fatalism.
Mm.
And, they say, aren't you concerned that you're going to give people a fatalistic view that they can't do anything about it? And what about then they raise like Nazi Germany? But the counter to that is most of the totalitarian governments are bad, and the Nazis didn't need genetics; they used
Exactly
genetics
right.
as a fig leaf to cover it. But the worst, equally bad totalitarian governments. So you think of Stalin. How many people did he kill? Mao and Kim Jong Un in Korea, and those are environmentalistic totalitarian. They don't believe in individual differences. They think that the state can make everyone be what they want them to be. So that gets under my skin a bit. But the main message here is that I think without doubt there's been a tremendous uh, societal change in acceptance of genetics. Like everywhere you read, I mean, it's almost gone overboard. People always talk, it's in your DNA. You see that all the time now. So I think taking the long view of this work. That is, rather than me sticking my head above the parapet and getting it shot off, in the 80s and 90s, it was better to wait until there's just so much data and until the DNA revolution came along. I never thought that would happen in my lifetime.
And when you say DNA revolution, you're referring to Human Genome Project specifically, kind of more broader, like just like
Well,
D.
yeah, the implications of the Human Genome Project, because it's a great example of blue sky science. I think most of the big applications weren't anticipated. It's just science kind of knew there it is. I mean, 3 billion base pairs of DNA. The next step has to be to kind of identify that sequence. But then you got all the DNA variants. You realize there is no human genome. We're all different. Even though it's only like 1% of the DNA steps in the spiral staircase of the double helix differ between us. That's what we're talking about with heredity, that 1% of the DNA. And so that made it possible by identifying millions of these DNA differences, like the SNPs that you use, and especially now with whole genome sequencing. That's the end of the story for heredity. So it was very exciting, and it just revolutionized genetics research. It became genomics research. We don't need
Well,
twin and adoptions.
and to your point, Robert, it went from sort of a more qualitative discipline to a super quantitative statistical discipline as well. Obviously, heredity is a statistical measurement. That's true, but very much it's been the case that genetics right now is very much data science. I mean, there's a lot of data. There's huge sample sizes. There's, a lot of, statistics and,
Yeah.
you look at GWASs, et cetera. I think that's really interesting because Post-Human Genome Project, you start taking atoms and translate them into bits, right? You have this massive increase in data and sort of these kind of molecular validations of the sort of, heritability studies that were done earlier, several decades ago. And so it's an awesome case of where, you start seeing these two different kind of, looking at, twin studies and actually be able to map that back molecularly. I think it's just really awesome. And then, seeing the models get better and better and better over time and building up to kind of broad sense heritability and knowing that's only going to improve. Um, and I think one thing that you mentioned here, which I think is really fascinating, is you talk about genetics as ultimately something about empowerment. Right. Genetics is actually the most liberating, it's the most empowering thing. I think someone could look at genetics and be like, oh, it's so bad because I don't know, maybe there's this argument that like we're all born different and there's sort of this genetic destiny. But you kind of turn that completely on its head, right? You talk a lot about this in blueprints and kind of integrating genetics into some sort of a self-understanding, where the abnormal is normal. And I'm curious on this point, which is like you don't really look at diseases or traits, you look at everything on a kind of continuum. Can you kind of elaborate on this where, people typically would see things as kind of black and white diagnosis, but you see things as almost a continuum?
Yeah, it's a huge issue in psychiatric genetics and really in a lot of the medical approaches to common disorders. And starting at the end of this has been going on for decades. I published a paper in 2009 in uh, genetics called Common Disorders Are Quantitative Traits. That is, there's nothing different ideologically at the extremes of these dimensions. There really are problems. People differ in depression, for example, but we always assume that by diagnosing them carefully, you get some ideologically distinct disorder so that these people have depression, major depressive disorder, and these people don't. At first, people thought they did candidate gene studies. They thought there'd just be a handful of genes that
Yeah.
account for the genetic influence.
Mhm.
But what GWAS study showed is that there are thousands of tiny differences. And
Yeah, and just so people understand this, if you go back to the late 19th century with Gregor Mendel, he's playing with his peas, and so everyone in high school has done a Punnett square where they say, oh, is the pea gonna have is the pea plant gonna be wrinkled or not? How tall is it going to be? What's the color of the pea plant? And implicitly, when you do that, you basically are mapping a phenotype, a disease or trait, say, to a single gene, right? So a lot of the times in people's heads, they think of, oh, maybe height or something like breast cancer, right? BRCA, they think of be caused by a single gene. But it turns out actually as kind of genetics has progressed in the last, century plus, many of the conditions that you've heard of from, height to cancers to intelligence, they're driven not by a single gene, but actually up to, millions of genetic markers even spread throughout the entirety of your DNA that you have to combine together into basically scores. And then these scores can tell you about someone's disposition, if you will, for different traits.
yeah,
And so Robert's talking about genome-wide association studies, which basically will give you insights into the kind of smaller effect size that these genetic markers have on the phenotype. And then what scientists do is they take these smaller effect sizes and they basically combine them together into models called polygenic scores.
yeah. And I'd like to say a little bit more about that, that we learn about genetics from Mendel. That's been one of the things that I find is difficult to straighten out in people's heads because you say genetic and they think single gene mutation.
Yes.
In
Very good.
fact, until recently, if you talk to journalists and the people who say in the traditional press, the guys who write the headlines are different from the journalist you're talking to. So you can talk to a journalist and say, we're talking about genetic influence on spatial ability. Please don't talk about the gene for spatial ability.
Oh my God, yeah.
What does the headline say? The gene for spatial ability. You
Yep.
know, and it's
And with
and it,
IQ, that happened a lot too. People say, "Oh, the IQ gene, the IQ gene, the IQ gene." There is no IQ gene. In fact, actually, there was the GWAS on homosexuality as well, and they said the gay gene. I mean, oh
yeah,
my God,
yeah.
and so we need to move beyond this as
And it
a
isn't
culture.
it yeah, it isn't semantic, it's important. There are thousands. What do people say now? 7,000 or so single gene mutations, most of which are recessive, which I'm very excited about with nucleus. doing carrier testing. Maybe we could get into that, but I think
Yeah, we
that
could.
is such an important thing to do and to offer to people.
Well, and Robert, it's so interesting because if you look at, classical, carrier screening, right? It's very much, follows the kind of classic, clinical genetics model of single gene disorders. But then you can think about the evolution here of going to polygenic conditions as well, right? Because there's always been there's many false dichotomies in genetics. The nature nurture one, huge false dichotomy. Common diseases versus rare diseases, another false dichotomy, right? You look at people who talk about polygenic scores versus rare variants, terrible false dichotomy. So I think what's interesting about classical Mendelian carrier screening analysis, where we look at, really bad markers, like let's say cystic fibrosis, doesn't impact your health, but could impact your children's health. People always think about the context for rare conditions, right? I mentioned, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs, there's many others. They usually don't talk about it in the context of, height or, IQ even, or, even cancers. And that's the evolution that people understand. You must be wondering intuitively as a couple, wait, I get that I can predict what my baby's risk for a rare hereditary disease is going to be, but how about for eye color? How about for, height, etc.? And that's the evolution I think people will intuitively understand now.
Yeah. And one thing more to say about this, I know, I know you know this, but I don't know if everyone in the audience does, that single gene mutations, they are real. I mean, like the ones you're talking about. You can trace them like Mendel's peas. They're like either or hardwired. If you get the gene for Huntington's disease, you'll die from Huntington's disease. It's a dominant gene on the tip of chromosome 4. It doesn't matter what you do environmentally, diet or whatever. So those are hardwired and deterministic, like Mendel's pea plant characteristics. And that's the way people learn about genetics. So that's why their head is wired to think about it as deterministic. But once you realize, like Fisher and Sir Ronald Fisher in 1918 wrote this famous paper which says, actually, there isn't a contradiction here between dichotomous qualitative disorders caused by a single gene and complex traits that are important in agriculture, animal husbandry, and humans. If you just simply say Mendel was right about the laws of heredity, but throw in a few genes. You just need 3 or 4 or 5 genes, and you quickly go from the dichotomy to the normal bell-shaped curve of continuous distributions. And the reason that's so important is you shift from a hardwired deterministic view of genes to a probabilistic propensity. And that's hard for people to get. Probability as a whole, people don't get. Even trying to explain risk for single genes as you do with nucleus on the carrier testing, that's not a walk in the park either. But man, when you get into common disorders and highly polygenic traits, it's tough. But at least if the audience knows, this is a big difference. It's not deterministic genetic influence or heritability that we're talking about for common dimensions, common disorders, and complex traits, not just behavioral ones. This is true in medicine too.
Genetics, I would argue, is literally everywhere. I mean, of course, it's our DNA, right? How many couples, Robert, go that I think this is generations way before Mendel. You didn't need Mendel for someone to go, is my baby gonna have my color eyes? That's a beautiful thing. That's genetics, right? How tall is my baby gonna be, right? Is my baby gonna be big and strong or whatever, right? That's all very intuitive. And genetics is just giving us it's following on the intuition that we've had. I mean, even R.A. Fisher, I mean, you look at the history of genetics, you see people deriving things about underlying principles of heredity without even knowing the molecular basis of what DNA is. I mean, that was true with Gregor Mendel. He didn't even know. He was an abstracted thing. It was a units of heredity for him, right? And then you move even to way before even Watson and Crick. You look at Thomas Hunt Morgan and Playing with the Flies. And this is the thing I really want the audience to understand, which is, to get a good intuition of genetics, you actually just have to look around, which I think is so cool.
No, I really agree with that. That's well said.
I want to ask you about how, like, you say the most important thing a parent can give their child is their genes. Okay. Um, and so, I want you to talk a little bit more about this. This idea I thought this idea is really interesting in Blueprint, which is like, hey, our genes expose us to do certain things. It's sort of this, again, it's our blueprint. We've been over this. And I want you to talk a little bit more about your understanding and your model of thinking about how genetics will shape someone and how actually the kind of seemingly very discrete things of nature and nurture are actually much more, I think, interacted than people think. Can you elaborate on this?
So DNA by itself doesn't do anything, but it's got the blueprint for the subtitle of my book is How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. But actually, if you look up what a blueprint is, an architectural plan, it doesn't specify the building, and you often depart from that as you go along, building a building. So I think it's not a bad word. But the reason how DNA makes us who we are is important. It sounds too deterministic. But what it should actually say is how DNA makes us who we are as individuals. It's the individual differences because the 99% of our DNA that's the same for all of us, that's what makes us human. But we're interested here in what makes us different. Why are some people schizophrenic and others not? Why are some taller than others? So I think it's important to recognize, well, the point of Blueprint is that DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals. So the basic point is that DNA is the major systematic factor making us who we are as individuals. The environment's important, but it doesn't work the way psychologists always thought it worked, which is nurture. Nurture is kind of the idea that what's important environmentally, this is from Freud onwards, is systematic effects of the family environment, basically what your parents do to you. Parenting is the critical factor in determining who we become environmentally. So much so that people always just assumed what runs in families is nurture. It's reasonable. Like take a trait where it's easy to see, uh, body mass index, for example. You know, um, People knew that ran in families. They knew the correlations between parents and offspring are about zero point 0.4 once the kid is now an adult. And they said, yeah, no problem. That's because the parents provide the environment for the kid. The food the kid eats and models lifestyle choices. So nurture is always a reasonable hypothesis, but it turns out it's dead wrong. Even for body mass index, there's no evidence of the effects of nurture. And that comes from just one of the quantitative genetic methods that's very powerful is the adoption design. So you can take kids adopted away from their birth parents at birth. So they're just as much genetically related to their kids as parents who rear their own children. But then you can also have adoptive parents who share family environment with the kid, but not genetics. So it's a neat way of a social experiment that separates the effects of nature and nurture. So parent offspring correlations for weight, body mass index are about zero point 0.4. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Well, the correlation between adoptive parents' weight and adopted children's weight is zero in half a dozen studies. No correlation whatsoever. But then does that mean it's nature? What runs in family is nature? The correlation between birth parents and their adopted away kids that they never see after the first week of life. This is back in the old days. It's not like adoption now. At zero point 0.4, just the same as parents who rear their own kids. So that tells you that what runs in families is DNA, and the assumption that it's nurture, family environment, even as reasonable as the hypothesis is for body mass index, it's wrong. So then what is the environment if it's not this nurture? And the answer is we call it non-shared environment. It's the idea that whatever's important environmentally is making two kids in a family different from one another. Growing up in the same family didn't make you similar environmentally to your siblings. What makes you similar to your siblings is that you're 50% genetically related to them. What makes you different is genetics. It's important to remember the other 50% of genetics makes you different. Siblings are 50% similar genetically and they're 50% different genetically. So, but the thing that surprised people is to realize that the environment is working exclusively in that within family way. It's making kids in a family different from one another. And what is that? And after 30 years of research, I've come to conclude it's basically random, chance, idiosyncratic, stochastic sorts of environmental influence. Now, there's a 30 years of research behind this, but it mostly is based on the fact that try as we will, study after study, trying to identify these non-shared environmental influences, you can't. So that's, I think, really interesting because it's suggesting that the way the environment works is very different from the way we thought it worked. And then you say, but what about correlations that we know between parenting and kids' environments? Like there are correlations between the food parents give kids and the weight of the kids, as they grow up. And we always assume, it drives me nuts. You see it in the paper every week where they they prey on young parents who are just freaked out about their kids, and from the parenting books, they think one false step and their kid's going to be screwed up for life. So you show a correlation between, say, how much parents read to kids and how well kids do at school in reading. You almost can't stop yourself. Correlation does not imply causation. You can't help but interpret that correlation. Yeah, parents who read a lot to their kids make their kids environmentally better, more prepared to read. Reasonable hypothesis, but it's wrong. And most of these correlations between environmental measures and children's outcomes, say, are mediated genetically. And so if people get anything out of this podcast, what I'd like them to get is that when you see correlations between supposedly environmental measures and outcome measures of children, force yourself to say, what about genetics? Because parents and offspring are 50% related genetically. Who are the parents who like to read and like to read to their kids? And why do they have children who do better when they get to school in reading? Can you see when you phrase it that way, genetics looms large? And the killer here is that people correlate number of books in the home. If you one single item try and predict how well kids do at school, how many books are in the home? And people knew that for a long time. There's a strong correlation, but they just say, yeah, sure, of course. If you have a lot of books in your home, means your kid is on a kind of educationally faster track or something like that. But it turns out it's genetics. Those books don't get on that there's genetic influence on these things. So that's the fundamental finding here, is that the environment that we measure in psychology is substantially heritable. Not as heritable as behavior, 50%, but more like 25%. But you're hard pressed to find a so-called environmental measure in psychology that does not show genetic influence. So books in the home, they don't get on the shelves. DNA doesn't put books on the shelves, but which parents have more books on the shelves? These are more educated parents who like to read. And so if you say, well, parents who are more educated or like to read have kids who do better when they go to school, you'd say, duh, that really could be genetic. So this is there are two ways then in which the genetics has told us more about the environment than a century of environmentalism, because environmentalists ignored genetics. And so all the research is confounded when you show parents who do this have kids who are like that. And instead, we know that genetics affects most of these measures we think about as the environment. And that includes like social support, used in thousands of studies are measures of life events. But the important thing for people to realize, these life events are not things that happen to you passively. Like the number one items that predict adjustment on life events measures are things like getting in conflicts with other people, having financial difficulties, for example. Well, that isn't stuff that happens to you. Oh, another one that gets people riled up is divorce. Being divorced 3 times, I know it isn't just something that happens to you. It's a measure of a relationship. And the point then is the environment isn't out there happening to us. We're actually creating environments that are correlated with our genetic propensities. So a concrete example of that will surprise people, is one of the most highly heritable cognitive abilities is vocabulary. And people say, how can that be heritable? I mean, you got to learn words. But if you think that, you're not thinking right about genetics. Your words are not encoded by DNA. What it is that some people are more attuned to verbal channels, and they want to know about nuances of words. And a lot of other people, like some of my grandchildren, say, whatever, you know what I mean. It does, but so you pick it up from the environment, but you're using the environment to foster your genetic propensities. And if you've ever tried, studying for college entrance exams or something like that, try to memorize words. It doesn't work very well. The way you learn vocabulary is on the fly in life. You work out the context of a word. Or if you don't know, you look it up, but you're trying to understand it in context. So the reason vocabulary is so highly heritable is that we can select environments. We can hang out with people who talk well and they're interesting to talk to. And you also modify environments and you actually create environments correlated with your genetic propensities, like you read. And so that's a good example of what in genetics is called gene environment correlation. It's the idea of selecting, modifying, and creating environments correlated with your genetic propensities.
And so, what you're saying here, Robert, is that genetics actually will shape the environment that someone's in. And so it sometimes people think of it as discrete things, to your point of there's genetics and then there's this outside environment that's something else. But then actually, it's almost like characters in these new AI worlds where you make the world. Like, as you're going through the world, you make the world, and then that's the world you end up being in, right? Um,
And
and
part of
I
that
find
is because a lot of the environment that's important is not this objective environment out there. It's how you perceive the environment. So two
yeah,
kids can be in the same classroom, but what they're getting out of the environment is really different. This really struck me when I was studying some super bright young kids, wondering how it is they become so bright because it's not coded in their DNA, you know, and it's not even really, I think, the hard wiring. I think it's more appetites than aptitudes in a way. Because what these kids were doing, they would go into a room and they would notice like the corners of the room and the angles on those corners. And they think about that. They're interested in that, and I mean, looking backwards, you can show that everything's determined, but can you predict forward? And the real argument then is, what if you knew every atom and everything about
exactly.
this? Could you replay the scene? And I don't think so, because identical twins are the closest we can get to that experiment. They have the same genes, but identical twins are different and they grow up in the same family. So what makes them different? That's what I'm talking about. What makes identical twins different? And they're actually a good tool for getting at this, and we've used them for that, and we can't identify anything. But as you said, you started out by saying, well, it could be a bunch of idiosyncratic events. It could be like genetics. It could be poly-environmental,
Yeah.
tiny effects of thousands of environment. It is environmental. It's not magic, or mystical. But at some point, you gotta say, well, people are now studying with real time sort of, um, uh, uh, virtual reality sort of stuff, trying to get at micro environments. But, so far it isn't very successful. And the reason is you can't add these up the way you can add up single nucleotide polymorphisms to get some sort of poly-environmental score. So I think it's real. But what interests me about this generally, I'm going to spend the next few years really focusing on stochasticity throughout all of science. It's amazing from quantum physics out to cosmology, with everything in between. There are books on randomness. And that's in sports, certainly, but economics, finally, these guys are realizing they're not very good at predicting stuff. And that's because we had this view everything's determined, and we just work at it till we figure out what causes everything. But it's kind of a sense of humility to realize that there there is a big role for chance. And you know, m- right now it might be an operational issue. We just don't measure it finely enough. But um, we've certainly gone a long way from thinking like Freud. There's some simple explanation, like the way your mother toilet trained you, that's going to cause schizophrenia. So I think it's a really interesting topic, and people talk about biological stochasticity. If you look at the complexity of biology, let alone the brain, it's surprising anything systematic can be pulled out of it because it's just so complex. An example of that is I'm saying that if there was a mistake made when you were born in the maternity ward and the wrong parents brought you home and you're raised in a different family, go to different schools, have different friends, I'm saying you would be much the same as you are now in terms of DNA. You'd be different, just like identical twins raised in the same family are different. And this isn't just hypothetical because there's this great documentary film called Three Identical Strangers that won a Sundance Award a few years ago. And it's the story of identical triplets. Identical twins are caused by one zygote that splits in the first few days of life. And so you got clones of one another, but reared in the same womb at the same time. And then sometimes one of those splits again. It's like 1 in 10,000 births or something like that. So these three identical twins had been separated at birth in an adoption agency in Brooklyn, interestingly, by a psychiatrist who thought this is the perfect nature nurture experiment, because then he put these kids in as different homes as possible, a lower class, a super wealthy family, and a middle class family, to show that it's nurture that dominates. And he never published it, in part because it showed the opposite. These identical twins are so similar. You see in the film, Three Identical Strangers, it's mind blowing how similar they are, not just physically, but psychologically. So it's a fascinating film.
I mean, what I like about that example, Robert, is it's intuition. And I think what's always so important when you try to teach people science is, it's teach people intuition. Because a lot of the things like, math is great, statistics is great, but a lot of people already actually intuitively know these things, right? So, everybody knows they're in class with someone who is brighter than them.
Yeah.
They just get it. And everyone knows that. Some people are more literally inclined. Some people are more, mathematically inclined. And I think that's an intuitive thing for people. Um, so one thing I want to talk about briefly before we go into kind of the future and looking ahead is just on parenting. You make a great point on how you should sort of, when you think about parenting, you should almost embrace the kind of genetic makeup of your child. You shouldn't, in a way, it's again this idea of liberty, which is sometimes parents will feel guilty. I did this, I made this mistake, I did that. But actually, you're saying, look, you should work with your kid and know that they have this genetic foundation, they have this genetic makeup, they have this blueprint, and really, there's not much you can do except for just kind of embracing letting your child be who they are. I want you to describe it, tell me about it, and yeah.
Right. Well, of my book blueprint, these 7 pages on parenting got more attention than probably everything else put together in the public press, because I was saying just what you said now, and it starts though by, in terms of your audience, if there's anyone out there who thinks kids are a blob of clay that you just shape to be what you want them to be, you really ought to read the book, because, as I said, genetics is the major systematic force making us and our kids who they are. The environment's important, but if it's this non-shared environment that makes kids in a family different, parents don't control that lever either. So if you think you're going to mold your kid to be what you want them to be, it's a big mistake, because it's going to be counterproductive. You can make your kid be a better musician. I made the mistake of saying my kids are going to learn how to read music and they're going to play the piano. But because they inherited my genetic orneriness, they said like hell, and they rebelled against it. They like music, but they weren't going to take these music lessons. But I was trying to make them be, I thought a cultured person ought to be able to read music, which is an incredible hubris. But it's what parents do a lot. They think they're responsible for the way their kids come out. I get these heartrending emails once a month or so from stories like, everything was fine, and then in adolescence and adulthood, my kid became successfully withdrawn and eventually diagnosed as schizophrenic. And they did the best they could. How could this happen? And so it's important that um, parents know that they don't have much effect on the way their kids turn out. So why not enjoy your children and watch them become who they are, rather than trying to make them into what you want them to be? And even more than that, to think of yourself as giving your kids opportunities to do what they think they like to do, because the appetites are important. And find out what they have to experience different things to find out what they like to do and what they're good at. And then once, they'll do things, um, like, if athletics, for example, if they find out they're good at a particular sport, it's rewarding, and they'll do it more and more and get better and better. So it's not to say parents can't have an effect. They can. Like me, I could force my kids to take piano lessons, but at what cost? If you think your kid's going to be a basketball player and they're 5'2", that's not very bright. But there are a lot of parents who really, they invest their failures. They want the kids to make up for their failures in a way, like with athletics or whatever it is. So I think it's very important that parents realize they have much less control over the way their kids turn out. And yet it's the longest relationship in our life. And so why not make it as good as you can? You know, you don't do things for your kids because you want them, you're trying to make them be a certain way. You do it because you love them and you want life to be nice for them, which doesn't mean giving them everything they want. You got to say, look, if you act like a jerk, people aren't going to like that and you're going to be unhappy. So you got to learn to be nice to people. So I think it's a completely different message from the thousands of parenting books out there. And none of them mention genetics. If they ever do mention genetics, it's these rare single gene disorders that reinforces the view of determinism. And they say, no, but parents are all important. There isn't a parenting book out there that has taken genetics on board. So I don't like to proselytize, but this is one area where I think it's really important because young parents, um, are they fall prey to the media, which gets a rise out of parents by saying, "Oh, you've got to do this, or your kid's going to be screwed up." So that's so to induce a skepticism in parents about these experts telling you what you have to do.
Well, it's interesting too, Robert, because again, going back to the idea of substantiating these kind of, this like kind of giving this genetic intuition, if you will, is that, one of the things my mom always said to me is when you were born, when your brother was born, your sister was born, they're their own world. And a lot of mothers have said this to me where the baby's born and you're like, this baby is its own thing, very different than the siblings, right? And it is going to be a certain way, and it's always been that way. This idea that like, for me, obviously, I have a bit of an unusual backstory, dropping out of college and doing all this. And, my mom always said to me that from a very, 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 very young age, the same sort of theme and kind of who I am can be seen. And same with my brother. My brother's very different than I am. And my mother said she can see that all the way from the very beginning.
Uh,
Um, and so there's this intuition of this kind of thread a parent can drop from literally the day they're born, like the essence, the vibe, if you will, the innateness of the baby. And to your point, that's actually a beautiful thing
it
because the
is.
greatest gift you can give someone is to let them be who they are.
Exactly. There's a great adage along those lines that says parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. So with the first child, you can explain anything away environmentally. Like ask parents, is your kid shy? If they're shy, ask them why they're shy, and you invariably get one of two answers. It's that I took her out too much when she was young, or I didn't take her out enough when she was young, which exposes what's wrong with environmental hypotheses. They can explain anything after the fact. But then you have a second child, and because shyness in infancy is one of the more heritable infant characteristics, you can expect that because they're 50% different, if one kid was very shy, the other one will probably be less shy. And so you then say, wait, whatever I did with the first one, I didn't do anything that different with the second one. And you begin to appreciate the differences between siblings. There's this famous author, Karl Ove Knausgaard in Norway, which about 20% of the population have read his books. He has a 7,500-page autobiography that's intense detail about kids' lives. But he was taught as a sociologist. And so he thought when he had his kids, it's just a matter of molding them to be what you want them to be. And he had three kids. And he would say, you can't find three more different kids. I mean, there's a genetic thread that runs through it. But as you were saying, from almost at birth, he could see that how different these kids were. And he said, he didn't do that. And so he began to realize that genetics is important.
Wow. Such an interesting narrative violation for parents, I think. And I think, Robert, one of the reasons why there's a couple reasons why genetics, I think, has been somewhat repressed and is so sensitive. One reason is this idea of it actually gets at the fundamental question of free will because people are scared of this idea of complete determination, right? Basically, that you're born and then that there's this fate. I think that scares people. Um, Another, of course, is eugenics and the way that totalitarian governments, um, I would say, use genetics, but it was never about genetics, to your point, to accomplish some sort of extremely corrosive agenda. But it was never about genetics. Um, and so I think on the topic of like determinism and kind of also related to the kind of post, again, World War II kind of understanding of how DNA shapes kind of who we are. someone could say to you, Robert, I understand what you're saying, but this is really dangerous. And they would say, oh, it's really dangerous because you're basically saying that someone on some axes, right? Let's just say intelligence. Someone is born genetically superior, right? Based off of, let's say, general intelligence G, and someone else is born genetically inferior. And they'll take the argument and say, given that, this technology will be basically abused to basically get rid of the people who are genetically inferior. What would you say?
Well, a lot of that comes from this wonderful film, 1996 film Gattaca, where you
Hmm.
GA,
Yeah.
those
Oh
are
yeah.
the four letters
Oh
of
yeah.
a DNA code. And it was that dystopian view of genetics. And this is before the human genome sequence. So it's a prescient book. It picked up on all the issues like prenatal diagnosis and,
Hmm.
you know, embryo selection for designer babies and even DNA mating, is part of that. So it was a very prescient book, but it took the dystopian view on each of these things, and makes it look horrible. But I mean, it's the science of it is actually pretty cool. I mean, to get that in 1996. So people do have this view that it's deterministic, and as we said earlier, it's not. It's probabilistic, and it's talking about what is in a population, not what could be. So I, in my book Blueprint, I published the world's first polygenic score profile for me and for its most of the psychological and anthropomorphic traits that we have polygenic scores for, like weight. And I'm kind of in the middle on a lot of these things, but I'm high on educational attainment. But my highest polygenic score is for BMI, body mass index, and I'm at the 94th percentile. Now, it doesn't mean you could say, well, then it's just fatalistic. You're just going to give up and say, eat, drink, and marry because you're just going to be fat genetically. But to the contrary, I find it's actually very motivating for me to lose weight because I know it isn't just the 5 pounds I put on at Christmas last year. This is a lifelong battle of the bulge. So what do? I don't say there's nothing I can do about it. I can do stuff about it. If I don't have junk food in the house because that bag of potato chips, just say, I'll just have one chip and then boom, the whole bag's gone. So it's been great for me. I think what's important is to say the reaction I get sometimes is, well, if I knew body weight was highly heritable and I had a polygenic score that says I'm likely to put on weight, I'm just going to not do anything about it, a fatalistic view. But what I'm trying to say is, to the contrary, I think it's motivating for people to realize this isn't just some environmental accident. You have a greater risk of putting on weight than other people. So if you want to do something about it, you can, because heritability is only describing what is in a population. And so with your body weight, if you don't eat, you're going to lose weight. And thin people like you say, well, that's all you got to do. But, people who have this genetic propensity like me to put on weight, it's tough. I was always trying to diet and, it was never very successful. You lose a little weight and you get this dangerous yo-yo thing. The second you look the other way, you start putting on weight again. So I find it very motivating. And it's also, I was an early adopter of Ozempic, you know, and I decided I was 250 pounds. I wanted to lose 10% of my body weight. Ozempic, over 6 months, I went from 250 to 225. I've been at
Wow.
225 ever since. It's like not carrying a 25-pound backpack around. So my joints are better, and it's interesting because if you stop Ozempic, I will quickly, like in a month or two, get right back up to that level. Even though I've learned these habits now for 2 years, I've eaten so that I've lost this weight with no problem. But if I stop taking Ozempic, it goes back up. There's research that shows that's true. You go back to 85% of what you were within a few months' time. But that to me suggests that it is more biological. I'm going back to some sort of genetic trajectory. And so, but the important point here is to realize we're talking about genetic influence, not hardwired determinism. And if you wanted to do something about your body weight, you certainly can. It might take a lot of free will, it might take strategic planning or whatever. But the point is, if you wanted to, you could, because genetics is not deterministic when we're talking about these complex traits influenced by many genes. It's probabilistic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's another great example, going back to your parenting example, where what happens is that, sometimes people look at the sort of genetic disposition of their baby and be like, oh no, this is some sort of, end all be all situation. This is sort of almost nihilistic because it's nothing you can do. But basically what you're saying, not just in that context, but also for adult populations, is actually this is the beginning for you to take more agency through greater self-understanding, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of messages here about harmony, say between parents and children. If if ADHD, hyperactivity is one of the more heritable childhood disorders, and if your kid's very active, and of course all kids are very active compared to adults, but if your kid is active compared to other kids, if you are genetically proposed to be very active yourself, you kind of can tolerate it better, you can understand it better, and you can realize your kid needs to burn off some energy or something like that. So it does suggest a different way of thinking about parenting that recognizes and respects individual differences that are inherited in your children. Not to say you can't change them, you can, but you go a lot further, I think, by respecting those differences and helping your child become who they are rather than what you want them to be, because you're not going to have much luck with the latter anyway.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Um, Robert, to close things out, I know we've been going for, more than an hour here. First off, this has been an awesome conversation.
I really
I
enjoyed
feel
it.
like you and I could talk about genetics for the next, 20 hours. I have so many questions. Especially because, as you know, genetics is becoming more and more productized, and this is going to be becoming more and more. Everyone's going to be knowing about polygenic scores. That's obviously what, our mission is at Nucleus. Um, and one thing that I want to ask you again, is sort of this idea of, you know, inevitably when we launched our genetic IQ score on, intelligence, there was very sharp kind of blowback against the academics, right? I can think of a couple that really came after what we did. And what we found was that, people, well, you know what they would do? They would look at the genetic IQ score and they say, that's cool. And then we get on with their life. Right. Because that's what people right. People use this information, they enjoy it, they really like it, and then that's that. But then you ask the academics, and it seems as if this information is going to ignite sort of some sort of, eugenics 2.0 phenomena where the technology is going to be, abused. And this idea of people being genetically superior and genetically inferior is going to be misconstrued. And I just want to know, you've thought about this for, at this point, decades. You've seen the kind of industry evolve. First, what would you respond to that? And then the second thing is, how do you think genetics is going to evolve in society? Do you think that, you know, a decade from now, 2 decades from now, 3 decades from now, people are going to kind of continue this trajectory and say, hey, actually, it's perfectly okay to pick your baby based off IQ? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, first, on the issue of eugenics, people are thinking of those totalitarian governments, and that's where Gattaca went wrong with its um, dystopia, because it was the government deciding, you couldn't have certain jobs unless you had a certain genetic profile. Now, in a way, the whole story is about this guy who wants to become an astronaut, Ethan Hawke, and yet he showed at birth he had a very high risk of having an early cardiovascular attack. So his whole thing was using Jude Law's DNA because he had been paralyzed in an accident, but he was a perfect specimen according to the government guidelines for what you have to do to be an astronaut. So he was using urine and DNA samples from Jude Law to get into Gattaca, which was the elite school for training astronauts. But now you think about that, though, and he ended up in the subtitle of the movie is There's No Gene for the Human Spirit. So Ethan Hawke prevails, and it's actually the end of the movie is him going up in space with his colleagues. But you think about that. What if he popped his clogs up there? That isn't ethical, is it? I mean, to say ignore this high genetic risk for cardiovascular disease. So that is not that's an example of where this dystopian view goes wrong. But it's really people think eugenics totalitarian governments. But what the trick that Gattaca missed, it was good about the science, but in the interpretation, they assume it's the government controlling this stuff. But the real message for all of these things, from prenatal, what you're doing with in vitro fertilization, it's consumer led. People are doing it because they want to do it. They're not doing it because the government's making them do stuff, you know? So I think that's the important message, and that's the way the future is going to be. It's democratized this information. So people who say, "Oh, we can't give people this DNA information," I think people ought to have as much access as they want. I don't think you force it on them. Like some of it's really tricky stuff, like the ApoE thing. We all are about a 50%, 15% risk at 85 or whatever to have signs of dementia. But if you have a double dose of that ApoE4 allele, you're at a, what, 60% risk, which in medical terms is astronomical. But even there, it doesn't mean you're going to have Alzheimer's. But 60% versus 15%, that is in medical terms a monstrous risk. And if you ask when I do a public lecture, I ask people, would you want to know? Because actually, right now, I mean, like 23andMe, they were giving people this information. There was a triple lock on it, but people could definitely get the information. And it's interesting. I find the audience splits right down the middle. Half of the people don't want the information. And why? Because there's nothing you can do about it. The other half, like me, say, yeah, knowledge is power, and I want to know as much about myself as I can. And I would go further and say, you can't do anything medically about it right now, but as we can predict who's at genetic risk, it's much more likely we'll figure something out. Because you don't learn about Alzheimer's or schizophrenia by studying schizophrenics or people with Alzheimer's. You've got to figure out what's making it happen progressively. But even more than that, I would say I can definitely do something about it. If I knew I was at a 60% risk for having Alzheimer's at 85, I would arrange my life differently. I would plan for that. I would have myself set up so that I could be taken care of later in life. But then I would also do a lot more carpe diem. I'd say, I can't wait till I'm retired to take these trips and things that I want to do. I got to do it now while I'm healthy. So I think knowledge is power. And I feel as you're doing in nucleus genomics, give people the opportunity. I mean, say you could tell this stuff. We're not going to say what you can or can't know from your DNA, but
Yeah.
if you want to know about this stuff, we'll tell you, and we'll support you because some of these things might be tricky for people to deal with. So we need to give them access to resources to deal with it. But I think it's just the whole democratization in the online internet world. It, it's just the paternalistic views, as you started out early in this conversation, saying it doesn't wash anymore. People aren't going to put up with it. And I think right on.
Absolutely. Okay, one last question for you, Robert, here. Gene editing. What do you think about that? CRISPR, the rise of different kinds of
Yeah, yeah.
sequencing, analyzing, engineering technologies. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, it's been a long slog, even for single gene disorders like cystic fibrosis, and they stopped the trials early because a kid died. There's a lot of unintended consequences of doing gene editing, but it's gotten kind of wild. You look online and you can find lots of cosmetic promises of gene editing. Well, the thing about it is, most of the things that interest us, like in the brain, we're talking about trillions of nerve cells. You're not going to change all of those. Cystic fibrosis works because you could deliver a gene that makes up for the deficit to lung. You have access to that, but there's not many examples like that. So I think for single gene disorders, it's possible. A lot better would be to do what you're doing, and that is to screen carriers. If everybody did that, we could get rid of cystic fibrosis.
Yeah,
So
I know. That's
I, I,
crazy. Yeah.
I so it's important. It certainly is an amazing, technological advance. But for complex traits influenced by thousands of genes, unless you can change the initial embryo, I don't see how it's going to work. Because how do you
And
change
what if you
all the
can
cells in the
change
body?
the initial embryo? What do you think about that?
Well, it's going to be hard to do because you're going to have to do it very quickly, right? Why not do in vitro fertilization and pay nucleus genomics?
Yeah.
You know, And then because you're going to get, I mean, people understand you got what 8 to 12. I mean, how many embryos do you usually have to work with in vitro?
Yeah, five or
Something like that,
six.
right?
Yeah, not that many.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they used to just say, "Oh, well, this one looks plump and nice. Let's put that one in." But, in vitro is so successful now, you can't, at least in the UK, you can't implant more than one because you get twins too often, and twins are actually a medical risk for you. So it's the old issue, how do you decide which ones to take? Well, certainly you screen out the single gene recessive sorts of things, which is what you're doing with carrier screening. People could still have kids if they did in vitro, and they screen out the 1/4 that are likely to have a double dose. But then you're still left with some. And what do you do? So I think I'm hoping nucleus genomics will give parents the opportunity. I guess you're partnering with genomic prediction that will can do this technique.
Yeah, we did
And
the
so
analysis and it'll do the testing.
yeah, and then parents, if they wanted, my feeling, and I know this is controversial, but I think if parents want to know about intelligence, which I think they will, um, it's the most powerful predictor we have in the behavioral sciences. It's more for educational achievement rather than pure IQ. That's the strongest prediction. So, I mean, I would be uncomfortable not giving them that information if they wanted it. But again, it's a matter of choice, and not being paternalistic about it and deciding what's good for people. Because in fact, parents, despite what they say, they are very concerned about intelligence. When parents look for uh, uh, when they try to get egg donors, and you can go to New York and there are catalogs that look like cattle things where you can find out about these different women who are offering their eggs, for example, and parents want to know about intelligence. It's like the number one thing they want to know about. Anything like years of education and that sort of thing. So I think parents will want to know about it, but I really think parents ought to be given the the opportunity to decide what they want to do, the information they want. And some won't want to know. I mean, is it still the case even with parents still, a lot of parents still don't want to know the sex of their child? Even though they do ultrasound or whatever, they don't wanna know. Fair
It's
enough.
similar to ApoE, right? For like Alzheimer's or you
Yeah,
said where it splits 50-50. It's very similar to that.
yeah,
Couples are very much it's 50-50. And I think you make a great point, which is ultimately it's about the liberty of the couple. Because I think what's gonna
yep,
happen is certain people are gonna say, hey, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't give this to them. But it's not their choice, it's the couple's choice. The only
exactly right.
person that should decide is not the government, it's not the
Yep,
media, it's not the scientist, it's the couple. And
I
our
couldn't agree
job as a
more.
company is to thoughtfully communicate this information, support the parents, and let them make the choice.
Exactly right. Well,
All right, Robert.
yes.
That's a great way to end the podcast.
Great to
Uh,
talk to you, Kian, and all the best for nucleus genomics. It's a great thing you're doing. The number one question I get from a public audience is, "Where can I get my polygenic scores?" And, when the book was written, I could say there's only one place, and that's Impute Me, which is Lasse Folkers. And then he is the scientific director for your company, Nucleus Genomics, and he's
and
always
this
been very
obviously
concerned.
acquired Impute Me, just so people know. We bought Impute Me, but yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah,
About
and
Lhasa,
he
yeah.
was always concerned from the start about interpreting stuff. It's a tricky business to explain these probabilities to people, and so a lot of the efforts going into phrasing it right so that people can get it what it means, not just to say you're at the 94th percentile for body mass index,
Exactly.
but to say how much variance is explained. What's your absolute risk, for example?
Exactly.
So it's such a good thing that you're doing. And now with 23andMe going belly up, there's actually, I could say before, well, you can get your genome SNP chips tested from 23andMe, and you can download it. And there's a half a dozen other companies that will create polygenic scores, but they're crap. I mean, it's a scandal that it's unregulated, and they give you something that's worthless, which kills me because it takes no more effort to do it properly to get a good polygenic score, but they don't, and you wouldn't know as a consumer. They don't tell you about what they did. So it's so brilliant what you're doing. So the only answer to that question now is when people say, well, where can I get my polygenic scores? The only answer is nucleus genomics.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate that, Robert. And I always forget how, it goes all the way back to Impute Me because a lot of people don't know we actually acquired Impute Me And Lasse and I actually, met over cold email because I was pinging Lasse under a pseudonym. I'll tell you the story offline because it's a great one. But to your point, we always were so concerned about how do people actually interpret the results, because science is one thing,
Exactly.
science communications is another thing, or how you actually communicate that. And I think we have spent so much time, so much money, and so much brain power to do it, and I think we've done it. And now we're taking it not just in adults, but also in human embryos. So, Robert, thank you so much. Really
Great talking.
great chatting.
Well,
Thank you,
thank
Robert.
you. I really enjoyed it. Cheers.